This is part 2 of our Honda TRX400EX top-end rebuild. If you need help with disassembly or assembly, watch our other videos in this series. Now that we've removed all the gaskets and O-rings off of the parts we're going to reuse, let's grab our new parts and we'll go ahead and reassemble those so that we can install them on the ATV. Now the parts that we're replacing today are the cylinder head and valve cover, along with the rocker arms and camshaft, as they were all severely damaged. Now the other part that we're going to replace is the cylinder. Now the reason we are going to replace the cylinder is after we evaluated the time lost and the cost of having the cylinder board and the cylinder head surface remachined, we just decided that it would be more cost effective to just replace it. Now the other parts that we're also going to replace on a normal typical top-end rebuild is the piston and valve terrain components, along with gaskets and O-rings. Now the other part we are going to replace is the intake manifold because of the cracks in the old one. Now Honda did update that part to a better design so that that won't happen in the future, so that's good. Let's start by reassembling our valve cover first, and then we'll move to our cylinder head. Now anytime you are replacing an OEM part like a cylinder head or a valve cover, they generally come blank. So you'll have to take all the old studs and bolts and whatever was installed on the old one and install it on the new one, unless you are replacing that. Now I've gone ahead and removed all the valve train out of the old valve cover and taken the parts that I'm going to reuse along with the new parts that I'm going to replace, and I'm going to install them in this new valve cover. Now whether you're using the old stuff or you're replacing it with new stuff, the process is the same. So let's go ahead and start by installing the long shafts with the large rocker arms. Now if you paid attention when you were removing them, that helps you with reassembly, but there is a diagram in the owner's manual that you can follow that will help you as well. Now the process of installing all of these components will be the same. We'll apply some assembly lube on there. We will make sure that the orientation is correct on our rocker arms or the follower arms. We will go ahead and thread the shaft into the valve cover, 2 or 3 threads. Then we will apply some thread locker and then torque those to 20 foot-pounds. Now on these smaller arms there is a small wave washer. You need to make sure that you get that on there. Now with all these little follower arms, the 2 intake following arms are the same. Now as far as the pin goes, there's only one size that'll fit it. The other ones are a much smaller diameter and they will go on the exhaust side. Now the exhaust side follower arms are different, but that's why it's so important when you do your disassembly and make note of that so that the reassembly is much easier. Now it's still in the OEM service manual, so you have 2 options there that will help you with your assembly process. On the exhaust arms, if you look really closely, they have a slight collar looking side of each one of them. And then the part that rests on the rocker arm is slanted, and they slant away from each other. So even though they look very similar to the same, they are different. Now the pads go towards the valve and the collar part goes into the case or into the valve cover right here. Now moving on to the cylinder head, the only thing we need to pull off the old one are the exhaust studs. Now I've already removed 3 of them and installed them on the new one, but I'm going to show you how to do that with this last one. So if you take your exhaust nuts that you already have on the machine and you thread one of them onto the stud first, all the way down, we'll screw a second one on and tighten them together. Now that's going to lock the nut to the actual stud, and then we can back out the stud. Now these can be very stubborn. If you end up breaking it or damaging it or you can't get it out, they're pretty cheap. Just go ahead and replace it. So now that we've tightened them against each other, now we can use the inside one and back out the stud. Now let's grab our new head and we'll just go ahead and install that right into it. Now when you're screwing it in, now you need to use the outer nut to tighten it. Now we'll go ahead and just break these loose and remove them. On a side note, anytime you're reusing a part on your machine or replacing it with a new one, it's always good to go through and chase the threads with a tap and die set so that when you do your reassembly process, everything will thread in really nice and you're able to get the accurate torque needed. Now the next thing we need to do on our cylinder head is install the valves. But first we need to make sure that all of the valves will seal correctly. To do that, we need to lap them, as they say, which is essentially getting liquid sandpaper and putting it onto the seat of the valve itself and lightly sanding it against the seat of the head. Now that's going to create better sealing so that your machine will run correctly. Now the way I like to do it is I found a piece of hose that will fit over the end of the valve very tightly. So once I install the valve, I can use the hose and just run it back and forth and rotate the valve clockwise and counterclockwise so that I get that sanding motion. Now once you lap one valve in one intake or exhaust, you need to make sure that that valve stays in that specific hole. You don't use one valve to do all of them. We'll pull the valve out and wipe both surfaces off, and then we'll use a Sharpie marker to color in the seat on the valve and on the head, and then we'll go ahead and reinstall the valve, put our hose on it, rotate it back and forth, and then take it apart again. Now this will tell us whether it's sealing or not, and if it's not, then we will go ahead and lap it again. Now if you look at the valve, you can see that it's pretty even all the way around it. Now the width of the actual shiny part, there's a certain measurement of that in your OEM service manual, so make sure that that's within spec. Now on the cylinder head, same thing goes for there. There's 3 different cuts, and it's the center cut that is the one that you need to mate it with. So it looks pretty even on this one as well. So we don't need to lap it anymore. We can go ahead and finish the rest of them and then install all of them. We can just use a little contact cleaner and a rag to wipe off the Sharpie marker. Now that we've lapped this one, we need to make sure that this valve goes back in that hole. So we're going to go ahead and number them so that it's easy to keep track of them. Now we just need to repeat this on the other 3 valves. Now that we've lapped all of our valves, let's go ahead and install our valve seals, and then we will install our valve assemblies. Now when you do your valve seals, just use a little assembly lube and they'll just pop right on. Now let's start with our number 1 valve. We'll clean it up, throw some assembly lube on it, and install it. Now we'll install the valve spring seat. Now what I want to point out with the springs is these are progressive springs. So the coil windings are closer together towards the bottom than the top. You just need to make sure that the closer windings go towards the head. And now our spring retainer, and we'll use our valve spring compressor tool to install our keepers. Now you can do this with your fingers. A pair of needle nose makes it pretty easy to do though. Now we'll slowly back off the spring compressor tool and make sure they seat good. Now that we have the keepers in, we want to take a rubber mallet and just tap the top of the valve so that we can get them to make sure that they're seated well. And now we'll just repeat this process on the other 3 valves. Next we need to prep our piston and cylinder. To do that, we're going to go ahead and check just the fitment of our piston, and then we will check our ring end gaps. Now I want to point out really quick, if you are going to reuse your old cylinder and you do need to send it to the machine shop, you will need to measure it and order the next size larger in your piston. You will need to take that and send it with your cylinder to the machine shop, and they will bore it out to the same piston size that you give them. Now they also will check your ring end gap as well, but once you get it back, you'll definitely want to check it yourself. Now if you do order a new cylinder, they come in the stock size, and so you'll need to order the stock size piston as well. And once you get it, you will need to double check your ring end gap just to be sure. So we're going to go ahead and check our top and second ring end gap. Now if you're not sure which ring goes on top, you need to check in your OEM service manual. Most of the time your top ring is lighter and slightly thinner, and your secondary ring is slightly thicker, as it does most of the work. Now the next thing you need to do with your piston rings is make sure that they're in the right orientation. There is a top and a bottom, and so you need to make sure that it goes, when you install it, goes in that way. Now the top of the ring, there will always be a number or a letter or a punch mark right by the ring end gap, and so that always faces up. So when you install it, make sure that that's facing up. So let's start with the top end ring. We'll go ahead and stick it in the top of the bore. Now we use the piston to make sure that the ring is exactly horizontal. So you just take it and you slightly push it down and use the piston as reference. Now we can check the ring end gap with our feeler gauge. Now whether you're using a stock piston or a aftermarket piston, aftermarkets will come with a spec that you'll need to go by, or you can check into your OEM service manual if you're using the OEM piston. Now we'll just repeat that process on the second ring. Now that we've measured the end gap, let's go ahead and install our rings, starting with our oil ring, and then we'll do our second and then our top. To do the oil ring, you want to start with the wafer ring and go ahead and install that. Now you want to make sure to alternate the gaps around the piston, and that goes for all the rings that you're going to install. So we'll start with the bottom oil ring. And then I always like to grab it from all four sides and kind of squish it in to make sure that it's moving freely. Now on your second top ring, they're a little bit harder to install. Just be really careful. I like to take the end and stick it in first, and then I will slowly work it around. And you don't want to pull on it hard, you don't want to break it. Now let's go ahead and install one circlip, as we'll install the other one once we put it into the machine. Now you can use needle nose pliers or a flat blade screwdriver or something, but what you want to do is start the circlip into the groove and then just slowly work it around into the, so that all of it hits the groove. Now once you get your circlip in, you want to make sure that the opening is opposite of the opening on the piston. Now the last thing that we need to do, since we're using a new cylinder, is we need to transfer the old studs off of the old cylinder onto the new cylinder. Now I found two nuts to do this. It's the same procedure we use to remove the stock exhaust studs. So you just put two nuts on the stud, tighten them together, and then you can back it out. Now I've tried to get these two studs out. They're not coming, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, and because the studs are fairly inexpensive, I just went ahead and ordered two more studs so that we can go ahead and finish this install. Now to install these studs, we need to take a little oil and put it on the threads. Now make sure that you have each stud in the right spot that it goes in, as these are different lengths and different colors. Now you also need to pay attention to the direction of the stud. Now this side has more threads and this side has less threads. Now on this particular cylinder, the side with more threads goes into the cylinder first. So we'll go ahead and put a little oil on that, and then we will thread it in. Now we'll just repeat that process all the way around, and then we'll go ahead and tighten them up. Now that we've got our studs installed and all of our parts prepped, we're ready to install them on the machine. This is part 2 of the top end rebuild on the TRX400EX. If you need help with disassembly or reassembly, check out our other videos in this series.